the 4 or 5 battles, and then at the consequences, and lastly, I'll look at historical narratives. That means that when historians write history, they write from a particular angle, even though they're presumably looking at the same evidence. They're kind of not, because the way that they construct it, they put their own spin on it. And this is known as historiography, the history of historical interpretations or historical narratives. And I'm going to give you a little bit of overview of the historical narratives about the war in the Waikato and those people who have written about that. So, and what I'm also going to do, and I thought I'd just mention to you, if I was teaching a Year 13 class, every so often, every 2 or 3 slides, I have one slide that asks them to think about what I've just talked about over the previous 5 or 6 slides. Now, you don't do that with adults, but I have used a different technique. I'm using technique of overlay. So if I plant a seed in one slide, I'll return to it in 2 or 3 slides later. But having said that, if you'd like me to go over anything again, I will do that quite happily. I like that kind of overlay technique, so that if you missed a little point, say, well, look, can you just explain that again? I'm happy to do that. So let's start. So first of all, I wanted to just establish that from a Maori point of view, this is a statistic that I picked up from 1855. So the 1850s was a period of huge economic activity by Maori, and the goods that they planted and tended and picked and packed and transported to market, and the market was generally Auckland and the other big cities, but mainly Auckland because of concentrations of population, was provided by Maori. And even the ships that did the shipping to Onehunga and to Auckland were 1/3 owned by Maori. So they're the people who are supplying the food for the Europeans that have just recently arrived in New Zealand. And I say recently arrived because the population grew from 2,000 in 1840 to 22,000 by about 1850. So it's really grown really, really quickly, and they need to be fed. And Maori were the ones who supplied them with that food. And these waka were generally, appearing at the markets in Auckland just about every day with food for the settlers. I wanted to plant this one here. This is one of the overlay ones because I'm going to unpack some of these items bit by bit. The Constitution was created in 1852, and that created a parliament. I'll talk about that in a minute or two. I'm going to allude to Governor Gore Brown, who was the governor at the time of the Taranaki War, and that immediately precedes the Waikato War, and he was unable to resolve it, so they brought Governor Grey back in just to do that, to resolve the issue of Taranaki and any possible problems with Maori in the Waikato. I think it's really significant, 1858, because the population at that time was 50-50. It's the first time the population has been even. Up until I said there was big growth in that previous slide, but you think even over the 1850s, it's still growing really quickly. And 1858 is a pretty pivotal time because for the first time in New Zealand's history, the population has been 50-50 Maori Pākehā. There was a conference in 1860, and the kingitanga who had been created over the side here, those chiefs were not invited to that conference because they were deemed to be by Gore Brown and Grey to be a bit too assertive and stroppy. And so they didn't invite them to the conference at Koimaramara. And the Koimaramara conference was really to try and reassert the clauses of the treaty. And if you remember from my treaty presentation previously, the Crown felt that they had sovereignty over all of New Zealand. This is under Article 1 of the treaty, the English version of the treaty. And Maori felt that they had retained rangatiratanga, chieftainship, under Article 2 of the Maori Treaty. And this is the bone of contention these days too. It's where Maori are saying, well, we've got rangatiratanga, we've got chieftainship, and the Europeans, the Pākehā, was saying, well, we've got sovereignty. So it's that battle between rangatiratanga and sovereignty that's always been an issue in New Zealand's history. A number of other chiefs boycotted the conference. Now I'm going to turn up. They said, no, we're not going. And and then we look at Kingitunga. I'll unpack each one of these in a minute or two, because they were the first pun iwi group, and I'll talk about that. Probably the most important point about them was that they were a land holding league. They said no more land sales to Pākehā. We want to hold what we've got here and now, because land is quite pivotal to us as a people. And you'll see how land becomes one of the issues in the Waikato War. And of course the other thing is Rewi Maniapoto helped the Taranaki Maori to fight against the British in Taranaki, and he was a supporter of Kingitunga. So he was kind of tarred with that brush, and certainly George Grey didn't like Rewi Maniapoto because he'd gone and got himself involved in Taranaki. So he thought that it was Kingitunga that was doing that. So we'll see that come out a little bit later as I unpack it a bit. Now this is really interesting. This is a 1860 map of the North Island. You notice that a lot of the South Island is fairly green, but the North Island was still a lot of red. That means it's native title, it's not crown title. The green part in there is crown title. It's been sold to Europeans by Maori, but this part down to the south, and it's no coincidence that the Waikato and Taranaki had the most primo agricultural land. And the evidence was that from the sort of trade that Maori had been doing in the 1850s. And a huge amount of good growing areas and stuff like that. It's got some pretty crap land too, around Pocono and so on. It's a lot of swamps and what have you that they drained subsequently, but it's also got some really good land as well. So that's quite significant, because a part of the way in which the Crown is going to get sovereignty, is going to get some degree of control over Maori, is if they get title to land, and it becomes a Crown title. Once they've got Crown title, we've always got, you know, the lands and survey title and so on. We've got Crown title to our land. I can see the survey pegs, I know, because the first house I bought in Kaukopakapa, the neighbour had shifted the survey pegs. And after I sold the house, someone rang me up and said, do you realise that your neighbour shifted the survey pegs from my house, the house that I sold him, and he'd taken about 2 metres of property. And it was annoying because I built a garage on there and I put it right up to the border, but the border was actually 2 metres further over. So those titles, those pegs, are actually important to define what you own, you know. And they're pretty hard to find sometimes these days, but that's it. Now this is the Constitution I mentioned before, the 1852 Constitution. Quite interesting, because they're trying to clone what was happening in the UK with a House of Lords and a House of Commons. The Legislative Council was the equivalent of a House of Lords. They said, well, this is a great system, we'll use this one. House of Representatives is the House of Commons equivalent. It's the lower house where members are actually elected. And then they had to look at the franchise. Who's going to be able to vote? And they just used the English system, which is a property criteria. It's a certain amount of value land that you lease or value of land that you own that gives you the right to vote in the elections. And of course, because it was individual males landholding franchise, Maori's land was mostly held collectively. Certainly land in that red part on that map was generally held by the iwi or the hapu. I say that because hapu was a sub-tribe of an iwi. Iwi is the tribe, so if we talk about Ngāti Whātua, which is the tribe in Auckland, we know that within that there are hapu, which are subgroups, which are marriage alliances over time, that are also subgroups within the major iwi. These days, some of the hapu, for example, in Northland, are bigger than a lot of the other iwi. They're so big, there's so many people involved with them. But this is significant because Māori, despite the treaty, are pretty marginalised by this 1852 constitution. They're not able to vote. Apparently some Māori did own land individually and were able to vote, and did. But most Māori were not able to vote as a result of that. And that, I think, was a huge flaw, and I think in some ways one of the causes of the Waikato Wars. And I'm saying here what happened to Article 2 of the treaty, and what happened to the Koa Marama Covenant that we'll talk about in a minute or two.
How would some,
Yep.
sorry,
Yep, go.
how would some individual marry or owned an individual, how would that have come about?
I think it would come about by them. I think there was so few that I could find that did this, you know. But I think that they must have decided that they wanted to have a plot. That well, maybe whole members of the other family had died off, and he was the only one left, sort of thing, you know. But land is, and I'll talk about that when I talk about the historical narratives. They were very important to them. But yeah, it's a good point. It is a good point, you
Can
know.
I just ask a question?
Yes, go for it. Yes.
Was there any disquiet voice written or anything about the fact that the majority of Māori were disenfranchised?
Well, certainly there was disquiet by some
Oh,
Māori
yeah, but
who felt
the people who were writing this legislation and
Yes.
making these decisions, did they just go blithely
They
along
just glide,
thinking
yes.
it was just what a norm, that's just normal?
that's the way.
So
And-
you don't think the governors, you know, had that in their mind, this is a way to
Screw them over.
not share,
Oh, no, I think a lot of it was written from England.
right?
It was
okay.
written by the Colonial Office,
Yeah.
people in the
Without
Colonial
thinking.
Office. Yeah, correct. Without realising what the situation
caring,
was.
I suspect.
Probably without caring, but written from the UK, because a lot of the legislation that gets passed in New Zealand in the 19th century was cloning what happened in England. Like, for example, a lot of the treatment of Irish in New Zealand was actually, Māori in New Zealand was written after the Irish legislation. The word, almost word for word, you can look at the Irish legislation to repress the Irish over an island, and it was written in New Zealand, you know. They used the same sort of language, you know. So,